Welcome back to another episode of In the East Wing. This is my conversation with Toby Harnden. Toby is an author and a journalist. He has spent many years of his life reporting from different places around the world, including Jerusalem and Baghdad. In 2012, he was awarded the Orwell Prize for books. He has written 3 nonfiction books, including the most recent one, titled First Casualty, The Untold Story of the CIA's Secret Mission to Avenge 9/11. There's definitely a lot more to say about Toby, but it is certainly an honor to have him on the show. I'm really interested in talking about just a little bit of your journalism background and perhaps war correspondence, if that's the right expression. Would you say
Sure.
that's it? Yeah. And I think when I was reading about your background, I noticed a sort of pattern where, or let me actually more accurately, I would probably say an interesting path, not a pattern. And that path consisted of a military career and then a transition to journalism. And that reminded me of a good friend of mine that I met in Lebanon who was in the U.S. military. He was with the Marines, but then decided to be a journalist. And I remember even before recording, I mentioned that he was in Ukraine for a while. And so it got me thinking about how, or it made me curious to understand how that transition happened, from sort of Royal Navy. I
Yeah.
think you were in Royal Navy, and then you decided to transition to journalism.
Sure. Well, thanks so much, and I'm very glad to be on the podcast. And I've enjoyed listening to some of the other episodes. And I know some of the people,
Oh, yeah.
like Jim Lawler, Mick Mulroy,
Yeah.
for instance. I know. Um, it's interesting. The transition was not as stark as you might think.
Mm.
I didn't find it particularly different world at all. So, in the Navy, and I joined the Navy. My father had been in the Navy, fourth generation military. I, I grew up listening to my grandfather's tales of World War II, and so I think I was always going to join the military, and I'm very glad that I did. And one of the things I really enjoyed about it was dealing with all sorts of people from all sorts of different backgrounds and at different levels. So ordinary sailors from Glasgow or the East End of London, admirals, and everything in between. And the other thing about it was, and everyone was crammed together on board a ship with maybe 200 people, and you get to know every
Wow.
single person in the course of a year or two. And the other thing that I really liked was the variety
Mm.
and the travel and the fact that I changed jobs every year and a half, 2 years.
That's exciting.
So I go to a ship, we'd sail around the world, um, and then I would go and get a job in the Ministry of Defence or at a shore base. And so there was a lot of change and a lot of variety, and very few days were the same. I wasn't going into an office every day. I was when I worked at the Ministry of Defence, the equivalent of the Pentagon. And journalism was a little bit like that as well. You're dealing with all sorts of different people. Every day is different. You change jobs every couple of years. I went to Northern Ireland. I went to Washington D.C. Went to the Middle East,
Mm.
and also both professions were sort of human centered. So dealing with people was a big part of it. And I guess I'm fairly outgoing and interested in people and what makes them tick and how things work.
Mm.
And so I did not find um, a, a big difference. I felt that in a way it felt like a natural progression
Wow.
for me.
Well, it's interesting that you put it this way because when you were talking about how you were building sort of relations with approximately 200 people on a ship, and you're sort of building more than just a relationship, but perhaps even a brotherly or family bond. They sort of become your family in a way. I think it sort of maybe gives you an insight as well into how, um, especially when you're covering or you're in the Middle East or covering a war, and if you're embedded with military personnel, it gives you an insight into how these things work because you've been on the inside, right? You have
Yeah.
some knowledge and you understand how to how they perhaps navigate such treacherous environments. And did that? Do you think that gave you better chances, or I guess a better, yeah, better chance at being part of these sort of missions or operations abroad?
Oh, certainly. And I think it's very important as a journalist to do something beforehand.
Yeah.
I think it really makes you appreciate what a great job it is, and what a privilege it is, and I think real world experience, because journalism is not really the real world. Real world experience is important, and so
Mm.
whatever you do, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't certainly doesn't have to be the military, but it's really good to do something else. And I'm always quite interested if say somebody was a lawyer or an economist or something, and then they became a journalist. And I think it really does give them an edge
Mm.
in general because of the life they've lived, but also sometimes in the particular field. And for me, certainly, my first big posting as a journalist was to Northern Ireland.
Wow.
And so, I became a journalist when I was 28. I know that's probably seems very old to you, but looking back, I was quite young. I And so I was posted to Northern Ireland by the Telegraph. I've been a general news reporter for a fairly short period, and I was covering terrorism and the British Army, and also paramilitary organizations, the IRA, loyalist
Mm.
paramilitaries. And it really helped me, I think, to be able to understand what soldiers were facing and what kind of mentality they would have and what kind of background they would come from.
Yeah.
Also, just basics of understanding something about weapons,
Mm.
but the rank structure, what a division is, what a brigade is, what a platoon is, what the role of a sergeant is, what the
Right.
role of a lieutenant or lieutenant is. So all that I think was really useful. And then later on, when in Afghanistan and Iraq, and young soldiers or Marines or whoever are pretty scared, I felt that I was able to relate to them because I see myself in them. And I understand. I think for many journalists, it's a leap of imagination. You can certainly do it, but it's a leap of imagination to understand why a young person might sign up for the Marines
Mm.
and be actually quite excited to go over to Iraq. But I really could understand that. So
Yeah.
I think it was useful. It gave me a little bit of credibility because I mean, a generation of journalists actually got a lot of military experience or experience with the military through embedding
Mm.
in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I think that's led to a lot of better journalism in a way. But at the start of that period, I think it was hard for a lot of journalists to be able to relate to the military because they never would have joined it themselves. That wasn't the culture in their family. They didn't really know anybody who had done it, and it was alien to them.
Yeah.
And I didn't have any of those problems.
There's something you mentioned to me before the recording about how you try when you're chasing a story or when you're writing about, you're more interested in the person or the humanity of the person. If that is that an accurate assessment, do you think?
Yeah.
Yeah. And through your experience, say, in Northern Ireland or even in the Middle East, um, how difficult was that for you to perhaps humanize the enemy or see or cover a story of a person that might be considered evil, but you're more perhaps interested in the story and highlighting it without your own take, highlighting your take on the matter, and sort of give us just knowledge sharing or knowledge generation. Like, I'm interested to know about that.
So I don't think I've ever found it that difficult
Mm.
to find a humanity in somebody, to be able to relate to their experience. even if I might, vehemently disagree with what they're doing, what their cause is, what their beliefs are,
Yeah.
to me, you put that to one side. I mean, and if you're condemning things either internally or actually externally, and condemning people and say this person is irredeemable, or even which is a very American thing, which I understand, but good guys and bad guys.
Mm.
I mean, really, most people are not completely good or completely bad, and things aren't black and white. They're generally uh, shades of grey, and that doesn't mean there's not right and wrong. And I feel I do have a strong sense of right and wrong. But to me, I didn't. So in Northern Ireland, I didn't find it difficult to understand why a young person might want to join the IRA
Mm.
and kill British soldiers if they had, watchtowers overlooking their, you know, father's farmhouse, if they'd seen their mother being, stopped and searched while she was going shopping, if they'd heard stories of discrimination in employment. I could completely understand it. It didn't mean I agreed with what they were doing,
Hmm.
but I could understand it and relate to it. And, wherever you go, people are still people, even if it's a completely different culture, say Afghanistan. If you see a beggar on the street in Kabul,
Mm.
a mother with two children, say, which I actually do remember looking out of, a building in Kabul in 2020 and wondering about what her life was like.
Yeah.
I think you can understand that she's in a bad spot, and to have reached that position in life, some pretty tragic things must have happened, and you can feel um, empathetic towards that. And one of the great things about journalism, proper journalism, is you go in with an open mind and you try and find out what's going on.
Hmm.
And I mean, some of the journalism I've enjoyed the most, or found the most rewarding, is where you go into a situation and you have to work out what's going on. And you talk to this person, you talk to that person, you see with your own eyes what's happening, and you work it out. And I much prefer that than going to set pieces that are created for the media, or where the journalist is a sort of a player, character in the play. I much preferred it to go into situations where I will be on the periphery and observing things rather than inserting myself into events and therefore changing the dynamics of what was happening.
Yeah.
But I just think um, it's a, it's a sort of a fundamental thing in journalism. If you can't listen to people, and if you can't make connections with people, and sort of enjoy people in all their variety, then I think you're in the wrong profession. Now there are some quite good journalists who are like that, who just sort of misanthropes, just don't really like people.
Right.
But I mean, I always found, actually, when I did big interviews with people, sometimes well-known people or some prominent figures,
Mm.
but one problem, I think it was a problem perhaps, that I would end up usually liking that person, partly because they'd given, you know, me time, they'd agreed to do the interview,
Yeah.
but we'd spent an hour or so of, intimacy. And sometimes it could be a little bit adversarial because I'd be trying to get them to talk about something they didn't really want to talk about.
Mm.
They wanted to talk about the tedious book they'd written. I'd want to talk about the controversy in their life, the elephant in the room, sort of 10 years earlier. So there was sort of situations like that. But um, I've never really enjoyed these very adversarial um, television interviews,
Yeah.
and I think I would find it difficult to do them. This
Clickbaits.
Yeah, and gotcha is the term. It's maybe a
Yeah,
British term, like where you're trying to trick the person. That's
yeah,
the classic question. But question is where you can ask a question, and that either way, the answer is a story. Is a story. Um, and I don't really enjoy that. And so for me, a central part of everything I've done
mm,
has been about being interested in people. And Jim Lawler was talking about this with you on your podcast. That there's always a connection you can make, and
yeah,
there's always something about even the most on the face terrible person
mm,
that is interesting and perhaps admirable, and you just try to find those parts of people.
yeah. I think a lot of times what um, drove me to be a curious person and really want to, I guess, highlight the humanity of a person is because I think I grew up in environments that were very tough, and you start to realize, or you start to appreciate life more for whatever it has to offer, and you become more, I guess, in tune with your emotions, and you start to realize that it could end at any moment, and you it's sort of like an awakening that makes you appreciate life more, appreciate the people that make up this life, and want to learn things and want to talk to people that know perhaps more than you do. And I think it humbles you in a way, realizing that you know just very, very little. And there's so much out there that can be, uh, there's so much knowledge out there that can be acquired, and people have stories and people have lessons and certain things that they can share with you that you can learn. And so I think
Yeah,
my experience, being in conflict torn areas for most of my life, it sort of humbled me in a way, made me more curious in people and in life, and I guess as cliche as it might seem, the purpose of life in a way.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And I think that setbacks in life, when things go wrong, I've always believed, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And all these accumulated experiences through your family, through your personal life, where you've lived, everything, good things and the bad things, they all combine to make you the person you are this particular moment in time.
Mm.
And I also firmly believe that there may be things that I know more about than most people, but every single person I meet will know a lot more about a number of things than I do. And so,
Yeah.
and I feel that the things I know, even subjects I'm pretty familiar with or stuff I've thought about for many years, I will still only know a fraction
Mm.
of the totality of that subject. And so clearly, we see it on cable TV and stuff. Blowhards, people who think they know everything or pretend they know everything, people who've got an easy answer to every question. I don't I don't trust that because life is a lot more complicated than that.
Yeah. Yeah. When you um when you first had an experience in the Middle East, Toby, what was do you recall what you were thinking at the time as you were about to travel abroad to perhaps an area you might not have been too familiar with? Uh, I don't remember whether it was Afghanistan or Iraq that you first went to in the region.
Iraq.
Iraq, yeah. How do you recall what that was like, mentally for you or physically as you were about to travel to a world that perhaps is not you're not very familiar with?
Sure. Well, I think throughout my life, in a way, I put myself in unfamiliar unfamiliar situations. So when I was a kid, I changed schools
Mm.
from the south of England to the north of England when I was 9, and so I had to go into a playground, not knowing a single person, having a different accent from everybody else, and knowing it was going to be a tough few days, and I was going to have a few fights, and then I would make friends.
Yeah.
And then doing a very similar thing when I was 14, and actually working out who who were the people who potentially friends, who were the people to steer clear
Mm.
of. And then obviously the Navy, you go into a military environment, you don't know anybody, you're in a system with all these rules, and you have to make it work, and it's very much outside your comfort zone. And going into a newsroom for the first time,
Yeah.
or Northern Ireland was a good transition period for me because it's part of the United Kingdom, but there's civil war going on and low level compared to other parts of the world.
Mm.
Terrorism going on, sort of armed insurgency going on. So I think I was reasonably well prepared. And also, I'd always been thirsting to get closer to the action. I mean, one of the reasons why I left the Navy was because I was sailed all around the world and seen lots of nice places, but I was based in Scotland for the Gulf War.
Mm.
I joined just after the Falklands War. And so I always felt I tried to get a post in Bosnia, which maybe wouldn't send me to. So I always thought I was missing out and I wasn't close enough to the action.
Yeah.
And so, and then 9/11, I was in Washington, D.C., and
Oh gosh.
I desperately wanted to go to Afghanistan, but the Daily Telegraph, the newspaper, said to me, quite rightly, well, you're pretty well settled in DC, you've got good contacts, and it's a very, America's at war. It's a very important story, so we want to keep you there.
Mm.
But I really, really wanted to be in Afghanistan. And then I remember, um, having my head in my hands when the statue of Saddam came down in Baghdad, and thinking, I can't believe I've missed another
Gosh.
war. So, so there's an element of be careful what you wish for, I guess, in these things. But when I got to So I got posted to the Middle East, to Jerusalem, based in Jerusalem
Mm.
in September 2003. And there was a sense at that point that Iraq was over,
Mm.
and that maybe it was going to revert back to, and Afghanistan was over as well, and that it was going to revert back to Israel, Palestinians being the main story in the Middle East, and that's what I'd gone over there to cover. But it became clear pretty quickly that um, that the wheels were coming off in
Mm.
Iraq, and I was the Middle East correspondent, and so I wanted to go there. And I can actually remember the moment when I realized that I just had to get there, which was I walked into the American uh, Colony Bar, which is on the Green Line in Jerusalem, and it's a famous hotel for journalists and spies and diplomats. So I walked into that bar, and I was meeting a friend of mine who worked for Le Figaro,
Mm.
and he was at the bar, and I walked in, and I said, hi Patrick, and he turned around and he said, Toby, what the fuck are we doing here? The story is in Baghdad,
Oh my God.
and when we're stuck in fucking Jerusalem. And I realized at that moment, I mean, I've been thinking along those lines myself. I realized at the moment he was exactly right. So there was a Sunni insurgency in Anbar province. There was a Shia insurgency in Sadr city.
Yeah.
There'd been Marines killed in Ramadi and Fallujah. There were um, sol- American soldiers being killed in Baghdad, and the story was over there. And so
Mm.
the next morning, I called the office and said, I think I should go to Baghdad, sign off from Jerusalem. So not just a trip. I had done a trip before. But sign off, go to Baghdad, and put Jerusalem in the hands of a stringer, and that for the foreseeable future, I would cover Iraq, which is what I did.
Mm.
But when I got there, I mean, I realized that there's a sort of psychological, almost a physiological thing you go through about danger when you get there. So there's like a lot of anticipation, and there was that corkscrew landing. I forget I think it was a Jordanian airline where you, you'd be high above Baghdad, and because of the surface-to-air missile threat, you'd be very high, and you do sort of corkscrew landing where you descend
Oh.
um, kind of very sort of vertically rather than like um, a slow descent into the airport. So you should go through that, and that's of course been written about, and so you could sort of expect it. And then there's the journey into Baghdad, and you sort of think, well, this is a war zone. And well, it was a war zone. And, could get killed at any moment. There could be an explosion. So all your senses are sort of heightened.
Mm.
And I remember getting to Palestine Hotel and meeting David Blair, who was the correspondent who was um, switching out and I was coming in. I've never seen a person happier to leave a place than David that
Gosh.
day. I think we talked for 20 minutes and he left. So this was May 2004. And yeah, we had a good conversation and we both agreed that the next thing that was going to start happening was kidnappings, that
Ooh.
Westerners were going to start getting kidnapped. And sure enough, Nick Berg was a young American who was kidnapped and beheaded on video shortly after that. So we were right. But I really remember that day because I sort of felt that I survived something just by getting to the hotel.
Yeah.
I hadn't really. I mean, a month or two later, that was a journey I would do all the time and wouldn't think anything of it. But it made me realize that your sense of danger and threat is very much tied to how long you've been in a place, what you're anticipating. And actually, that early period was very dangerous
Mm.
in terms of calculating risk. The really important thing is how to calculate risk, how to how to deal with risk and danger, and how to make decisions about where to go, what to cover, what journeys to take, what journeys not to take, who to work with, who not to work with, who to trust, who not to trust. And in that early period, there was a like very early on, like in the first few days, I almost realized it at the time that I'm taking too many risks here because I was so desperate to get to the story. Like to Najaf was um,
Yeah.
being held by the Mahdi army at that point, and there was this um, big push from the news desk and from colleagues that the place to be was Najaf. The journey was dangerous.
Mm.
You had to go through these sunny areas. Um, I didn't know the fixer and the driver very well, so I didn't know where they were coming from. You know, they were both Sunnis, but we were going into a Shia area. All these nuances I didn't really understand, and so we went down. You know, 2 or 3 days in, we went down to Najaf, and as we got close, I think it was Kufa was the name of the place, just north of Najaf. We were held up by the Mahdi army, dragged out of the vehicle. They were holding up our body armor and helmets and saying, Americans, CIA,
Gosh.
all this kind of stuff. And I remember getting into we were taken away to be questioned. I remember getting into this truck and sitting on the back, and beneath our feet was just hundreds of RPG rounds.
Oh my God.
And I was very calm, partly because I just think I've always known that the worst thing you can do is to panic and just to look at things, to just try and slow down, control your breathing, watch what's going on. That's a much better thing to do than start running around with your hair on fire. But I remember looking at the translator um, fixer called Salah, I didn't really appreciate all this at the time. He's a Sunni.
Mm-hmm.
This is a Shia militia. And I looked at him and I said, I felt okay. So I thought, okay, this is Iraq. This is stuff that happens. You're here. You've chosen to be here. Just deal with it. But really, I had lost my perspective a little bit because it was much worse than I thought.
Mm.
And realizing when things are dangerous and you're in a really bad spot is important. I remember looking at Salah and he just looked really sad. I remember looking at him and saying, "Is everything okay, Salah? Is this okay?" And I guess I was expecting him to say, "No problem, we'll be fine. It's just one of those things." And
Yeah.
he looked at me and he said, "No, Toby, no, it's not fucking okay." And
Oh
so
God.
it was a bit of a level setter that I realized, okay, this wasn't just another day in Iraq. It was dangerous. And looking back, we probably shouldn't have done that trip, or we should have done it in a different way, or I should have got at least one a sheer driver, or somebody who had a bit of local knowledge.
Mm.
And I think sort of 2 or 3 months into it, I was much better at assessing uh, danger and risk and making informed choices. But in that early period, I was sort of suppressing fear or danger. And also, I was just really, really, really eager. Felt to me like of years of missing out on things. I was
Yeah.
really eager to get to the story. But of course, you know, hopefully our lives are going to be long. There are plenty of opportunities to do things, and you have to stay alive to be able to do them. So it would have been pretty stupid to have got killed on that, second or third day or whatever it was.
That's right. That's right. You spoke of being, being accustomed to a place or getting comfortable with a place after spending some time in the set place, and I think I remember growing up. Obviously, I witnessed the fall of the Gaddafi regime in Libya when I was
Yeah,
10,
yeah,
and that was obviously pivotal moment in our lives because we had to experience for the longest time uh, this sort of uh, war as it unfolds. Obviously, there was a NATO interference, and so all you hear oftentimes is, the bombs dropping and the windows rattling, and you sort of grow accustomed to the situation. And I think that period sort of made it very. It was it's so firmly ingrained in our memory because it sort of was perhaps our first ever experience being in a zone that is, I guess, bombarded in a way. And then throughout the years, ever since then, you get, I think, what scholars would call a protracted civil war. Every now and again, you have factions fighting. You hear guns being shot, rocket launchers or bombs being dropped, and so you grow accustomed to being in such environments, and it sort of becomes your new normal. But no one actually prepares you for that. There's no way that you can simulate, I guess, that real experience, viscerally real, in a way that you can't, simulate that to make it more, to make yourself more comfortable as you experience it for the first time. And so
yeah,
it's sort of interesting how one can be torn between two worlds where you can live in a place that is perhaps more peaceful and comfortable. There's comfort, but then at the same time, you can easily you can bounce. You can go from one place that is more uh, where there's literally no action, and then you go to another place, and it's just immediately it's like a flip switch. You find yourself in that different zone, and you can operate properly. And it's just,
yeah,
but there's no way that one would be able to know how that feels like until they experience it.
yeah. I think one of my theories about life is hopefully we get to when we're very old and we're at the end of a natural life. So we sort of live the full distance. And I imagine, and I've talked to a lot of old people. At the moment, I'm doing researching CIA history, and so I speak to a lot of people in their 70s, 80s, 90s,
Yeah.
and I feel that people get to the end of their lives, if they're lucky enough to get to the end of their natural life, and they think, I've just worked it out. I've just worked out how this thing works, and then that's it. That's sort of the beauty of life, that we're always learning, and every you know cocky teenager thinks they understand everything and
Mm.
they know more than you do. But you mentioned something earlier which I think is very important, which is particularly when you're younger, but it's not just when you're younger, it's all the time, is to appreciate and talk to and listen to people who have experience in things,
Mm.
uh, whether it's because they're older and they've done lots of things, or whether they've lived in a different country or been through an experience. You can always learn, and there are so many people who go into a situation thinking they know it all, and they don't listen to, So you go into a newsroom, and there's some grizzled old veteran who's been, doing it for 25 years, and maybe he's drinking too much and has got lots of boring stories. You know what? They, they, you could probably, you can be almost sure that you can learn some things from that person.
Right.
And so I think that's a very important thing in life, to learn from other people. And as an older person, I'm 59 years old. Um, there's a lot also that I can learn from younger people.
Mm.
Sort of some obvious things like technology and stuff, but sometimes attitudes of, I may have all these prejudices or assumptions about a certain subject or a certain person, and sometimes a young person can just cut through it. And so my kids sometimes, my son will sometimes say things. He's 16 or my daughter's 17. Sometimes I'll talk to my son about something, and he'll be like, you know what, that's just not right.
Hmm.
And I would have been thinking, well, maybe it's right. I think it's probably not right, but maybe it is. But it's just because I don't know enough about it. And he'll just cut through it. So,
Yeah.
so sometimes that's a good level setter, to talk to somebody who's sort of younger and outside. But you always have to be learning from other people, I think.
Mm. Would you say, Toby, that that attitude um, was present even early on when you found yourself in um, perhaps the toughest situations in life abroad, where you had to learn lessons or what life is like from people of a different world, of a different culture? Did you have that same attitude back then?
I think so. I mean, I think as you go through life, you accumulate experiences, and each thing informs you.
Yeah.
And having children is pretty humbling. For
Mm.
instance, it's one of those things,
Yeah.
and that changes you. Um, but yeah, I mean, I grew up with parents who were interested in the world, who were sort of adventurous in their own ways, although they didn't travel particularly uh, widely.
Mm.
But I think I remember a phrase of my dad's, oh, something would happen. It's all part of life's rich tapestry. It's sort of meaningless phrase in a way, but I guess what he was saying was, life has lots of different experiences, and different things. And so, for instance, when I got so in 2005, I
Mm.
was arrested in Zimbabwe and imprisoned,
Yeah.
which ended up being for 2 weeks. I didn't know it was going to be 2 weeks, and on the morning of day 14, joke was beginning to wear a bit thin. And if I'd been convicted, I could have spent 4 years.
Good Lord.
And I was with a colleague and friend photographer, and we sort of had these conversations. But we were in African jail,
Mm.
and the country was breaking down. The system in the jail, in some ways, was breaking down. I think there was one other white guy in the prison who was a South African
Mm.
who had AIDS and was in a terrible, terrible shape. And we were taken to meet him. Like, you never need to meet the other white guy. Um, but and we were in a cell of a little over 100 people. and it was murderers, rapists, armed robbers, quote political prisoners, and that's why we were in there. But it was all sorts of people, and you get in there, and it's pretty frightening. You worry about things like rape um,
Yeah.
and violence, and so when you first get in there, you're like, okay, so what's this? How's this going to work? What's this going to be like? But pretty soon, I mean, in this case, we realized that it was structured. It was a bit actually like the IRA wing of the Maze prison in Northern Ireland, where it was run along military lines, where there was a commanding officer, a number of deputies and sort of lieutenants, and
Mm.
it was very structured. And we realized that we sort of had value in that we could. So the currency was soap and cigarettes, and we were meeting with lawyers most days, and we would be brought soap and cigarettes. So we literally had currency.
Wow.
Um, we they People felt that we could help them, that we could put them in touch with lawyers, we could get their story out to an extent.
Yeah.
I suppose we could, and so we were looked after, and we had people assigned to us who were sort of like bodyguards, and nobody messed with us, and it was actually in some ways quite well ordered. Everything was quite well ordered. There wasn't random violence or bad stuff
Mm.
going on. Um, and we had each other, which was good, but we sort of made friends and had great conversations with these guys
Wow.
who had had incredible lives, and a lot of them were in a bad spot. I mean, we were fortunate. Our case was tried almost immediately. Other people have been, because this was a remand prison. Some people have been held in remand for 2 or 3 years, and they were in terrible
Mm.
state. And there was a lot of, actually, the worst thing, which I underestimated at the time, was the disease in the prison. That was the worst thing. That was the biggest
Ooh.
danger. Actually, Julian got a couple of pretty bad diseases, and I was okay. So I don't know.
Okay.
Um, I don't know why that was, but yeah, I think that my experience, I don't know, in the Navy, in Northern Ireland, in Iraq, all that sort of helped. And also it was a perspective thing because Julian and I both spent a lot of time in Iraq just before then, being terrified of being kidnapped and having our heads chopped off. And,
Mm.
the worst fear, and I went through the fear sometimes when I thought it might be happening or be about to happen, that you'd just be, you know, in a vehicle or in your hotel room or interviewing somebody, and you're just grabbed, and the next thing is you're in an orange jumpsuit, and you're being videoed, and you know who knows what's going to happen, or when it's going to happen. So we've been through that, and so we both said to each other, well, it's not Iraq. We're not going to get beheaded. The worst that can happen is, because we were charged with practicing journalism without accreditation
Oh.
under this very repressive um, Mugabe era um, law in Zimbabwe,
Yeah.
and the maximum penalty for that was 4 years, and we knew this, and so we were like, well, the worst thing that can happen is we'll be in here for 4 years, and obviously that's a long time. It was a worst case scenario. I generally think the worst case scenarios, generally speaking, don't happen.
Yeah.
But even so, it's it's a lot of it, the psyche, or our psyche, was a lot different from if we'd been taken by some Sunni group, or some robbers, sort of bandits who might have sold us on to Al Qaeda.
Oh
That
yeah.
would have been, we would have felt very sort of different. So there's a perspective thing, and so we a little bit like going on to that's schoolyard when when you're nine. You sort of have to survive, and you have to make alliances, and you have to work out um, who's who, how the system works, and who to avoid, and who not to antagonize, and who to befriend. And so we just did all that, and it worked out fine.
Gosh. It's just these are the experiences I think that shape us and make us more, in a way, less. We stress less when it comes to the small things, I guess, because like when you experience such deep or very rare scenarios in life, it just these things become more. They impact the level of, I guess, again, the appreciation of life, and at the same time, you start to, I guess, worry less about the little things. You maybe start to see the bigger picture. I don't know if that resonates.
That's certainly true,
Yeah.
but it can also work the other way.
Oh.
So there's a difficulty sometimes with acclimating to ordinary life after intense experiences. And this is a part, I've done actually quite a lot of work at different times on PTSD. So I did a panorama documentary in Britain about PTSD and suicide in the military. And I remember coming back from Afghanistan in 2009. I'd been in Helmand province, and it was carnage really at the time with a British unit. Lots of soldiers were being killed. Been out on patrols where you think that the next step that I take, the ground may erupt and I'm going to lose both my legs or be killed. And so I've been through that, and I remember coming back to Washington D.C., going into the office building where I worked, and the security guard there, who I knew, who I'd sort of said hello to, yeah, most mornings for 2 or 3 years, asked me for ID because there'd been some security threat or something, and people had to show their driver's licenses.
Okay.
And I kind of exploded, and I just basically said, like, what the fuck do you mean? You know who I am? It's ridiculous. Like, just no. I'm not showing you my ID. What are you going to do about it? Like that sort of reaction. Okay. And then I caught myself on, and that's because I'd been through all these intense experiences recently, where it felt like things were life and death, and then I had to deal with everyday bullshit. And so, I mean, that's a common thing amongst people who sort of served in war zones. That kind of movie scene where you go into the supermarket aisle and there's 25 different types of cereal, and it's so jarring because you've been in a place where all those everyday mundane things don't matter, and you're just focusing on staying alive and doing your job and surviving until the next day. So there is that issue, but big picture, certainly you appreciate life because you don't take it for granted, and you've known people who've been killed, and in some cases friends, and there is a feeling that I have sometimes that you live a good life and a meaningful life in part because other people didn't get that privilege through just the randomness of the human condition. And so I think those two things are maybe in tension with each other, but yeah, I do think big picture, these experiences help you appreciate life and keep things in perspective. And I do try, mostly with success, to not sweat the small stuff and not get really agitated about this politician does this or says that, or there's this video or this crazy thing that was said on cable TV. I mostly don't care because does it really affect me? No, it's stupid, and I'm not going to get sucked in.
Yeah. Well, Toby, I would love to perhaps do part two with you, and we delve deeper into your books, which I will highlight in my introduction after we wrap up our recording, and I'll also attach to the episode when it's published. But we have sort of reached, I think, an hour mark, and it pains me to have to really uh, sort of conclude our conversation. But I do want to say I truly appreciated your insights into conversation and the perspective that you have. It's just I'm always very grateful and blessed that I get to have people like you on my show and talk about life lessons and uh, the things that perhaps make us who we are, our rich experiences that make us unique. And I'd still be interested in doing perhaps part two because I think there's a lot more to talk about.
Sure. Well, thank you very much. Very happy to be a guest. I enjoy the podcast. Good luck with it. And you've had an interesting life and got some interesting stories to tell yourself.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I think I'm sure there's a lot more that we can learn from each other. So thanks again for joining me, Toby.